Thank you. My apologies for that glitch. We had tried it out. There was a little piece of animation in the slideshow, and so it's particular to use that, and had tested all the folders, but we still had a glitch. But thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. Many thanks to the People's Republic of China and UNESCO for inviting me here, and to the government of Hangzhou. I want to talk about built heritage and sustainable cities, but I also want to talk about heritage in a larger context, because I don't know that I can separate built heritage so specifically from other types of heritage. If you look at cities, and I'm looking particularly at a case in India, and if I look at Indian metropolis today, this is the kind of urbanization on the one hand that we see of a very rapid growth, and also of very extreme inequalities that emerge with the kind of the models and paradigms of urbanization that are ongoing. This is the previous slide was of Mumbai, and this is another view of Mumbai, which is the Dharavi slum in Mumbai. And the kind of technological sort of solutions that are generally advocated, which this, for instance, is the sea link that goes out into the sea and back onto the island of Mumbai. And on the other hand, the kind of exclusion that is often the outcome of many of these types of developments. This is in Gurgaon, where it is just outside of New Delhi, the center of IT development today, and a booming multinational city, or a city of multinational corporations, rather. And it is at the same time, the people that you see here are the urban villagers who have been basically squeezed out of the city because of the nature of development that has taken place. And on the other hand, you have, of course, the kind of iconic monuments that are seen as the heritage of India. And so part of what I'm looking at then is to really examine what it is one can do to connect the kind of, to first of all understand heritage in a broader context in India, and then to see how we can connect the modes of development with heritage. And the work that I wanted to show you briefly is with the that I've done with the NGO that I had in Bangalore in India, which is also a research unit at Columbia University. That this is with UNESCO New Delhi. So to look at the region that I'm looking at is in the southern part of Karnataka over here. As you can see, it's about 4 hours from Bangalore. And on the one hand, you have, of course, the kind of classical heritage of the temples and tanks, which is an 11th century city that I'm talking about, called Belur. But you also have, and you know, these are sort of the listed kind of recognized heritage, but you also have the unlisted, unrecognized heritage, which is the vernacular architecture of the place. These are earth buildings, earth and stone, with handmade tiles that have carved wooden columns, and these are the handmade tiles, and in some instances stone columns, which is an area very rich in granite. It also has a variety of performing arts and crafts and an exquisite local cuisine that is based on local types of native plants of different types. There's festivals. These are festivities associated with the temple that are huge annual festivities. And it is the seat of Indian classical temple dances. This is the Bharatanatyam, which is being done now in front of one of the temples. Has a very rich hydrology and landscape with these structures, some of which are 14th and 15th century structures. Some of the lakes themselves go back to the 10th century. There are other potentials to these sort of places, which is looking at relatively slower speed, mostly pedestrian. We're looking at a smaller town, not a huge metropolis. And that's where I think there's a lot of potential, because the number of small towns is obviously far, far bigger than the number of huge metropolitan cities. The streets are interactive social spaces. There's a very strong sense of community and identity. There's relatively lower mobility because the community is pretty stable. There's a traditional cuisine that, as I mentioned, is related to native seasonal plants. But there are many challenges because there are neglected structures. The infrastructure is inadequate. As you can see, this is an open drain that serves both as a stormwater drain and as a sewage. The solid waste is often dumped into the ditch, which is actually a moat around the fort. So it's 11th century moat. And the new construction that's coming up, which you can see on the right, is entirely incompatible with the kind of traditional materials and so on. And despite the kind of rich hydrology of this area, there is inadequate water supply, and so you end up with a situation where people are short of water. Now, one of the things, so how do we address then, looking at this kind of heritage, how do we start to look at making the city not only in terms of conserving and protecting the heritage values, but also looking at the new modes of development. So one of the things, of course, is to be able to bring people on board, including the officials, and see how they can relate to and understand what the future of the city might be like. And these are drawings that we make to basically convince the local officials and the community of the importance. So this is a sort of an extrapolated drawing of what might happen if you allow the current trends to continue. This is the kind of impact that would happen to the same street. And similarly, this is another street around the temple with the current state, and this is projected if the trends continue. And this kind of impact visualization allows people to recognize that, yes, immediate action is necessary in order to make the cities sustainable. So I'm going to run through really quickly a few different types of, so the range of different types of interventions we've undertaken are very wide, and I'm just going to run through a few different ones to show how, it's not just about looking at conserving specific buildings or adaptive use of a particular structure, but it's a sort of a range of interventions at different scales, from planning down to really interiors and very small details. And I'm not going to be able to show you all of it, including the master plan and so on, but I'm just going to show a few. So first of all, even identifying, interpreting, conserving, and presenting heritage in a meaningful way is very significant, because there was only one, for instance, in this town, the only structure that was under protection when we went in here was the main temple, and we identified 42 other historic structures, and this was done with the help of the local people. Similarly, we reinforce and promote the sense of place and identity through design and development of public spaces. As we heard earlier, public spaces are very, very significant in people having a strong sense of identity. And this is the main street leading up to the main temple that looks very blurred. And the reason it looks very blurred is because it had just been widened when we entered this project, when we took on this work. They had just gone through a street widening procedure, and that's a very ordinary, regular, routine kind of development work that all good governments undertake. But nevertheless, we're going to widen a street in a historic area and make it vehicular, and they have big buses going down there and parking at the end of it, completely, making the view of the temple gate, creating an impediment to the view. Then it's obviously not a very sensitive solution. So what we suggested instead was to completely pedestrianize the street, to relocate the parking that was originally located in front of the temple, and to pave this whole area, create movable structures that were for vendors to sell food, and create a food and washing area, an open cafeteria, and an entire sort of covered street. So we're actually suggesting narrowing the street with a covered walkway, which is more like the original porch that was very typical of the kind of built environment of this area, where most structures, this is, as I said, this has been built, the fronts of 200 and 300-year-old buildings had been locked off in the effort to widen the street. And so what we were looking at is actually densifying the street and creating this kind of walkway that could become then a public space for micro-enterprises and small artisanal enterprises to operate. So developing and promoting the market and for traditional and artisanal enterprises and retail was obviously a very big part of this whole thing. That was the animation that's not going to show because we moved computers. So we had animations walking through the street that we're not going to get to see. Modifying and adapting local materials and construction technologies was another aspect where this kind of, the traditional construction was made of earth with some stone slabs. And earth construction, first of all, was very high maintenance. The local people did not appreciate having to continue with that because it meant they had to do a lot of work annually. It also meant that the walls had to be very wide, and so the rooms quite small, and they wanted larger rooms and larger windows. And so what we're looking at is finding a balance between what people's aspirations are and what the kind of the heritage values were, and sort of finding a via media that would allow people to meet their contemporary aspirations and still retain much of the identity of the older structures as well as much of the built form itself. So we worked with the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, which is a very premier scientific institution with some material scientists who've been looking at different ways to add and modify earth construction so that it could become more stable and stronger, and so you could mix in small amounts of cement and make them into blocks. So the production process itself is made very much more streamlined. It can happen at a sort of a small workshop where you create many blocks of this kind of earth blocks, and then the construction proceeds much faster as well because the earth construction can take a very long time to build. And so it's sort of updating it to current and contemporary needs. As you can see here, the older form, and this is the kind of workshop where people are able to do this in blocks. And so it's the same earth masons the masons who work with earth, who are able to be re-employed for this kind of work. So it also provides opportunities for local employment and uses local materials. Green design for tourist facilities as well as residential infrastructure was another concept where we were looking at in situ a toilet, in situ sewage processing. So the toilets for both the tourist facilities as well as the homes could be made with in situ processing, because although the city is supposed to have an underground sewage system operating, it's not yet complete in all, as I say, in all phases. And it takes many years for all phases to be fully funded. And so our approach was to say that we can't, if you don't have sewage for the whole sewage treatment for the entire area and are not able to undertake sewage at the same time, then it's better to move with some amount of in situ processing so that there is the underground water doesn't get polluted. Modifying regulatory frameworks for regeneration of housing and neighborhoods, where we studied the existing historic areas in the neighborhood, street patterns and housing patterns. We derived very carefully through a systematic study of these and proposed model neighborhoods for, again, it's a via media. The government regulations ask for low-income, middle-income, high-income site planning and plotting for neighborhood development, and we could only suggest modifications to that rather than completely rethink the way neighborhoods themselves are being planned. And so what we suggested then was neighborhood planning that had followed the existing patterns and had some backyards and some neighborhood open spaces, which they currently lacked. And so that we could look at this, for instance, is an idea of how you could have growth without losing identity. So here is a middle-income group layout that could look like this in 3 years and like this in 10 years. So there is a much greater densification without losing the identity of the area. Similarly, here is how a house that is like this could be added on to and greatly increased in its size without losing the street identity altogether, or the identity of the house. Conserving, adapting historical lakes and ponds for the hydrological system. Here, for instance, is one that you can see is very heavily eutrophied, the lake. It was also a place that, it looks all very green, but actually it had steps behind it. These were 10th century, 11th century steps. So we were looking at creating only rowboats as a part of a recreational area and desilting it and creating, you sort of recover these steps, restore these steps, and create this as a point. Also, it was interesting because we saw that the water in this place, when you took the stormwater drainage and you separated it from the sewage, because we were looking at in situ processing, as I mentioned, that was another reason for looking at in situ processing, was to separate the stormwater drains from the sewage so that the stormwater could go into these two lakes at the two ends, and so it would keep the lakes then rain-fed through the year as opposed to being just seasonal lakes. And this was actually how, when we studied the topography of the town, we found this actually worked with it. And I think this is the last thing I want to talk about, which is encouraging local investment in tourist facilities and services, including homestays, where we identified heritage homes that were over 100 years old, and these were all over the walled precinct, and then looked at very simple ways in which these could be renovated to be able to accommodate guests and to be able to have a simple bathroom that could be added onto where the water tank could be just inserted very simply, and guests could stay. The last thing I want to talk about is how this was something that I did with a design school in Bangalore, where we're looking at heritage and local identity for the design of souvenirs and tourism products. This wasn't an area that had a lot of handicrafts, it had a lot of building crafts, but what we looked at was how we could look at the heritage and use the heritage as an inspiration for different types of craft activities, using local materials that the student designers helped to design, because this could then provide employment to the local women and use local products to create better souvenirs. These are games that they designed and packaging, and here is textiles that they designed inspired by the kind of identity of the place. So I just want to conclude with this one last diagram, which is to say that heritage-compatible, heritage-sensitive sustainable development for cities is sort of a way of finding and negotiating a variety of very different pulls on city development, from cultural heritage conservation goals, local economic development goals, environmental conservation goals, tourism development goals, and sustainability goals having to be negotiated and resolved to find solutions. So, thank you very much.